Hi, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Molly Ball. My name is Carell Centers, and I'm broadcasting live from my desk at Bookshop Santa Cruz. And this is where I have the pleasure of putting together the author events for this store. And here at Bookshop, we know there's a lot going on in the world right now, with a global pandemic that has changed our way of life, and with this renewed and so far sustained movement for racial justice and equity that is once again filling our lives with the urgent message that Black Lives Matter. As a bookstore, our values are aligned with the fight against ignorance and for inclusion and representation. And while author events can allow us a sort of shift in focus from these difficult topics, we also really appreciate how books, especially like tonight's book, and the authors behind them are always in some way in pursuit of the truth. So we see these talks as a way to deepen and refresh in order to return to the vital work that is before us. We want to thank you for joining us as we find these different ways to live in and respond to the many critical elements of being human. So tonight we're thrilled to welcome Molly Ball to discuss her new book, Pelosi, and I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Molly tonight. I took no small amount of pleasure in page fogging my copy of the book, so I was very, very much a page turner for me. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for audience questions. And I'm going to really quickly walk you through the Crowdcast platform so you have a sense of how everything is going to work tonight. You might be wondering what's visible here. All that we can see is the name that you registered for the event under and that you're live in the event. So we can't see into your living room and we can't see what you're eating for dinner or anything like that. This event is being recorded so that you can rewatch it and share it with others after the event is over. And that will become available shortly after the event concludes. You can find it right back on this page using the same link that you used to access it tonight. To the right side of your screen, there's a chat box, and that is where you can engage with one another and respond if you'd like to what you're hearing and seeing tonight. You can also pop in there any tech issues that may come across. Hopefully there won't be any, but anything that might happen there, my co-host and I will be monitoring the chat box there, so you can let us know if you need any help. Below the screen, towards the bottom, you'll see a little button that says Ask a Question. That is where you can pose your questions for Molly Ball tonight, and you can do that at any point during the event. You can just click on that, add your question, and also view and upvote other questions if you see one that you're interested in hearing answered. Also, maybe really important for us tonight, just below the screen is a green button that says Buy the Book. If you click on that, it'll go straight to Bookshop Santa Cruz's website, and you can order your copy of Pelosi tonight. And you can have that either for curbside pickup or we'll ship it to you wherever you live. And you can also make donations on our website for our events program, or you can do so at the donate button at the bottom of your screen right now. And thank you so much to everyone that has donated tonight. Your donations are keeping our program vital and going strong. So we really appreciate every dollar counts. We do have a pretty full calendar coming at you for the rest of July and into August, including Jesse Wegman and Eric Swalwell. So definitely keep an eye on our calendar, both on Bookshop's Crowdcast page and on our website to stay abreast of everything that's happening in our events world. And again, just please be sure to support us with your book purchases and your donations. And we thank you in advance. So on to the main attraction. Molly Ball is Time Magazine's national political correspondent and a political analyst for CNN. She appears regularly on PBS's Washington Week, CBS's Face the Nation, ABC's This Week, and other television and radio programs. Ball was previously a staff writer for The Atlantic and has reported for Politico, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and the Las Vegas Sun, and she's worked for newspapers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Cambodia, as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post. Winner of numerous awards for her coverage of American politics, including the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize and the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. Molly is a graduate of Yale University and was a 2009 recipient of the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowship at the University of Michigan. And in 2007, this is the fun tidbit that I have to mention, in 2007, she won $100,000 on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Molly grew up in Idaho and Colorado, and she's joining us from DC area tonight, and we're so grateful to have her here with us tonight. Welcome, Molly Ball.
Thank you, Coral. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming and for your interest in the book. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're so happy to have you. Yeah, like I mentioned, both in the green room and in my intro, I found the book to be such a page turner. Yeah, I'm generally more of a fiction reader, but I just kept wanting to dive back in and get to know Nancy Pelosi more. So I'm so excited to talk with you about her tonight. So I'm going to be glancing to the left where I have my notes. So forgive the shift in eye focus there. So there's so many different areas of the book that I would love to explore with you. And she's been in politics basically since birth, born into a really political family in Baltimore. And her first official political gig was in 1975 in San Francisco. And then she moved to Washington to serve in Congress in 1987. So the sweep of the book was really interesting to view in terms of recent history and the 5 administrations that she's worked with. But really the book is about Nancy Pelosi. So I'd love to start there. She's really fascinating and inspiring. And I love the line when she's a little girl and she learned that, you know, her vocational choice of priest, which not nun, but priest, was not available to little girls. She decided to become a politician instead. So was there something specific that kind of got you hooked on on writing a book about Pelosi after covering her for some time?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That's a great question. And thank you for your kind words about the book. I very much wanted it to be a narrative that people could appreciate as a story, whether or not they're interested in things like Congress and the internal politics of the Democratic caucus in the House. So yeah, the way that I got interested in Nancy Pelosi as a subject and the way the book came to be is that in late 2017, I left The Atlantic, where I'd been a reporter for 6 years, and joined Time Magazine. And one of my first assignments was a cover profile of Nancy Pelosi. She had actually never been on the cover of Time Magazine, despite being the first woman Speaker of the House way back in 2007. She'd never been on the cover of any American news magazine, not Time, not US News, not Newsweek, when those were more vibrant competition to Time than they are today. And she was a little bit bitter about this. She'd occasionally drop hints here and there, you know, mutter like, isn't it curious that all these men have been on the cover? But our idea for the profile wasn't just, well, we owe it to her after all this time. That's not how the news business works. But we were going into the 2018 midterms. And she was really the center of that entire election. If you think about it, this is the first national election of the Trump era. The Senate's not really in place. So the whole election is about, will the Democrats be able to take control of the House of Representatives? And, you know, the Republicans had said outright that she basically constituted their entire campaign strategy. It was they were going to overcome the sort of headwinds of the Trump backlash by putting Nancy Pelosi in $100 million worth of campaign ads all across the country, tying the Democratic candidates, especially in these sort of moderate to conservative purple districts, to everything that Nancy Pelosi represents, this polarizing, unpopular, quote unquote, San Francisco liberal, and make the case that, you know, all Democrats are sort of crazy, far left, out of touch. She was also central to the Democrat strategy, right? Because she's the biggest fundraiser for the Democratic Party. She has for a long time been the most prolific and talented Democratic fundraiser, but she was also the source of a lot of angst because Democrats had come to view her as a liability because of all the Republican attack ads, because of this polarizing image. And so there was all the narratives at that time were sort of, will she be the obstacle that prevents the Democrats from taking the House? Or if, you know, even if they do take the House, can she overcome the divisions within the Democratic Party, within the House caucus, to become Speaker again? Because she had to fight to remain the minority leader in 2016, lost a third of the caucus because there was so much angst about her public persona and about the attacks, and also about just the fact that she'd been in leadership for so long that she sort of had stifled young, promising, up-and-coming Democratic members of the House from making their way into the top leadership. But meanwhile, this is all happening, right, against the backdrop of starting the day Donald Trump was elected. We saw a historic groundswell of women's political activism, women voting, women organizing, women running for office in just astronomical numbers. This was something that did not happen for Hillary Clinton, even though she was the first woman major party nominee. But as soon as Trump was elected, it just happened overnight. So it seemed like there was sort of an irony here. And it also seemed like, even her opponents did not question her competence. I spent a long time covering the Republican Civil War. And if you remember, the Republican speakers of the House, Boehner and Ryan, the House was always shutting down or on the brink of shutting down. It was gridlocked. It was polarized. Nothing was getting done. And in all the talk about her shortcomings, nobody really questioned her ability to do the job at a time when everything else in Washington seemed to be broken. So we had our first meeting. We met for an interview in January 2018 in the place that she's from, Baltimore's Little Italy. And we met in a little pastry shop, and what was going to be a walking tour turned into a driving tour, because one of the reasons Nancy Pelosi likes California is she hates the cold. But the first thing she did, despite the fact that it was 20 degrees outside, she ordered chocolate ice cream for breakfast. So this is clearly someone who does what she wants and doesn't pay a lot of attention to what other people might think. I went with her after that on a fundraising trip to Houston, where, she had twice the schedule I did. Her shoes are twice as high as mine. She's almost twice my age, and she completely wore me out. At the end of our 3-hour dinner that night, I was exhausted and ready to collapse in bed. And she said, well, I'm going to make some calls to the West Coast. It's still early there. And I sort of realized, maybe there's something remarkable about this person. As a profile writer, you love to write about the big colorful personalities, right? The Sarah Palins and Lindsey Grahams and Stacey Abrams and Rahm Emanuel, the politicians who have the soaring oratory and hilarious quips and just big colorful personalities. And she's kind of the opposite of all that. So I wasn't sure if she was really all that interesting. But I wrote the profile. She finally was on the cover of Time magazine for the first time in September 2018. Shortly thereafter, the Democrats won the midterms, and there was this sort of hilarious 180-degree reversal in her public image, where all of a sudden everybody who had previously been saying, well, maybe it's time for her to go, all of a sudden sort of went, maybe she is good at her job. Maybe we should keep her around. And then, of course, there was that moment that's on the cover of my book where in December 2018, when she had the meeting in the Oval Office with Donald Trump and her Senate counterpart, Chuck Schumer, where she interrupted the president, stood up to him, said, Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength that I bring to this meeting as the leader of the House Democrats who just won a big victory. And then walked out and put on that red coat and the sunglasses and the little smirk on her face. And you could tell, from the way this exploded on Twitter and became a meme, that Democrats were so hungry to see someone stand up to Trump in that way, and especially to have it be a woman, to have it be, a competent, strong woman who knows what she's doing. That was really, I think, emotionally satisfying to a lot of people on the left. So I felt like there was a bigger story to tell than I'd had room for in my profile. She's one of those people that I think everyone has an opinion about, but few people actually know very much about. And she's not a natural storyteller herself. She doesn't talk about herself much, tell her own story. So I felt like someone ought to write a book, and maybe I should be the one to do it.
Wow. Thanks for taking us through that. That's really interesting. I was surprised to hear she's not a natural storyteller, because sometimes the lines in to the sentence level of, the things that would come through in the book were so vivid, like certain, phrases or things she would remember people saying. And I was like, did she have a diary when you were interviewing her? Like, how did she, or did you I know you interviewed multiple people to kind of gather the full spectrum, but how did that work in terms of recalling such specific moments?
Yeah, well, she does have a sort of steel trap memory. She also has written a memoir, and there have been a couple biographies written of her the first time she became speaker back in 2007. And of course, a lot of contemporaneous coverage over the course of her career. So yeah, I just, I did a lot of archival research, conducted more than 100 interviews with people who've known her at various stages in her life, friends and family, people who know her personally, people from her political career. So I was able to reconstruct a lot of that, because there is a lot of evidence on the record. And she and I talked a lot, about her roots and about where she came from. It was interesting to me in that first conversation that we had in Little Italy that, as you mentioned, she comes from a political family. Her father was a sort of legendary Democratic congressman and then mayor of Baltimore. And so she was born into politics and went into the family business. I think naturally a lot of people, when they think about her, write about her, attribute a lot of her political orientation to, it's just genetic. But she really took care from that very first conversation to talk about her mother and her mother's contributions to the family political career, right? In a lot of, for a lot of politicians, they're just sort of the front man of a family enterprise, right? And the whole family is involved in the effort. And that was certainly true of the D'Alessandros in Baltimore in the 40s and 50s. But her mother didn't have the title in front of her name, didn't have the credential, so she never gets the credit. And it was clear to me that Nancy Pelosi wanted to sort of recenter her mother in this narrative. And in fact, that is why I actually begin the book with the story of her mother. She also was very frank about the limitations that have been placed on her mother, talked about how her mother wanted to be an auctioneer, wanted to go to law school, invented and patented a beauty product, wanted to start a business, wanted to make investments. But in those days, you needed a man's permission. You needed a man's signature on the checks, and her husband would not give it to her. So so Nancy Pelosi was very frank about the fact that was also part of what she learned from her mother. She saw those limitations, and she wanted independence. She wanted to be in control of her own life in a way that she saw her mother wasn't able to do. Her mother also, I think Nancy Pelosi gets some of her personal qualities from her mother. This is a woman who supposedly punched a poll worker in the face at one point, chewed out LBJ to his face, also Ronald Reagan. So she was pretty tough. And wow. And the Nancy Pelosi and her brothers would always say that she was the real politician in the family. So wow. So conversations like that helped me develop and deepen my understanding of where Nancy Pelosi comes from, and also how she views her own experiences.
Gotcha. Yeah. I was really interested in the kind of contradictions in her character, which, yes, she comes from this political family, and you talk about how she was doing the favor file. She was in charge of the favor file in the living room for the family kind of political machine. And she kind of maybe observed that and saw that in terms of getting that exposure to the family business. But it's very clear in the book. No, she did this, she excelled and actually outperformed in some ways. Like when she actually got that, when she first went to Washington, like her brother and father were like, oh, she's actually doing like a really good job. She's not just resting on, it's not just being handed to her. She's like working for it. And then, just these different, so she kind of like pushes hard, and she also holds back. She has integrity, but she's committed to compromise. You talk about how she knows every name of the 435 members of the House, their issues, their districts, their family situation. But then the vibe in her staff is much less familiar, much cooler, and maybe more distant or more professional. She cares about the environment, but she was flying back. Every week she was flying home. I'm like, ooh, that's bad for the environment. And things like that, where I thought it was really interesting to kind of see those contradictions. And I wondered if you think that kind of makes her part of who she is in terms of, the flexibility with the integrity, and if that kind of helps her to be good at her job.
Yeah, those are really good, really interesting observations. And yeah, I definitely agree. We're all bundles of contradictions in some way, right? Like we all contain multitudes. But I want to go back to your earlier point about the influence of whether she's a sort of self-created or created by others, because I do think that she is very conscious of, and I certainly became conscious as I was reporting on her, of the way powerful women's success, there's always a sort of hunt for a man to attribute it to, right? It's sort of unconscious, but they're always, you see this with like AOC, people are constantly asking, well, who's pulling the strings? Who is it really? People just can't believe that it's her intelligence, her ideas, her political orientation. And you see this a bit with Nancy Pelosi, that people always say, well, she learned everything from her father. Well, her father never wanted her to go into politics. Her parents wanted her to be a nun. Her father didn't even want to let her go away to college. It was her brothers who sort of got that tutelage. And I think she obviously did learn a lot from that family political environment, which was very much the sort of old school urban democratic machine politics that we associate with places like Baltimore in the 40s and 50s. And you mentioned the favor file, right? That sort of informal living room constituent services operation where people could just come to the mayor's house, and if they were hungry, she would feed them. If they needed a job or to get on welfare or to get into the public hospital, her mother, and then later her, from the time she was 11, would help them get those things, and then would go around and collect the favors when the election rolled around. So that very much informed her idea of campaigns in particular. To this day, she believes that you don't win an election with a lot of fancy, expensive TV ads and consultants, as nice as those things may be. You win them by knowing exactly who your voters are and where they live, and turning them out precinct by precinct, block by block. At the same time, her political role model was much more JFK. And as a Catholic, as a devout and to this day very faithful Catholic, she admired JFK for what he represented in that regard, but also the way he interpreted his Catholicism in sort of a liberal way, right? She's clashed with the church a lot. She hasn't agreed with them on things like abortion and same-sex marriage, but she interprets her Catholicism similar to the way that the Kennedys, I think, do, as being about lifting up the lowest among us and seeing the humanity in all people. And because of that, she has a great sort of moral and pretty consistent on just about every issue in her public life, even as you say, she is a compromiser. She is not someone who's going to stake out a position and hold to it and not get anything done, because she does value results above all else. And that, I think, is the other theme of the book, is that she is always about getting results. And that's part of the reason that she doesn't do things like go out and demand that people stop saying mean things about her, right? Because that just doesn't matter to her. What matters is, can I get this legislation through? Can I advance, liberal priorities to some small degree, even if to everybody else on my side, it seems like I'm selling out? She feels she's moving the ball an inch down the road. That's enough for her.
Yeah, that brings me to another question I had about whether, like, how progressive is she, and I feel like we can kind of get lost in the spectrum of Democratic, people, but, there are mentions in the book of her reigning in the extreme left. And I'm just wondering, like, I don't actually have a sense of quite how progressive she is. I know that she and AOC actually ended up kind of being on the same page and being allies and stuff like that. I don't know if that's still the case, but yeah, where do you think she kind of falls in the progressive spectrum?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I do think that she sort of epitomizes the modern Democratic Party in a lot of ways, but also she has played a big role in crafting the modern Democratic Party in a lot of ways, right? There's a sort of obvious metaphor in her coming from the urban Democratic machine politics of Baltimore and ending up as the epitome of the San Francisco liberal in a party that has become much less of a sort of urban white ethnic party and much more of a coastal educated party in terms of who they represent. So, and she's played a role in that, right? She was instrumental in bringing the Democratic Convention to San Francisco in 1984, for example, and ran the delegate operation for that convention, and then made a failed run for DNC chair that was marred by some egregious sexism, among other things. So to your point, I mean, this is something I've thought about a lot, and it's something that she sort of constantly finds herself in the middle, right? Depending on what audience I'm giving a book talk to, I'll either get a question about, like, well, why is she such a corporate sellout and doesn't support, them? Or from the other side, like, why is she such a horrible liberal and she's so lame and screechy and far left? I think she is sort of in the heart of the modern sort of progressive Democratic Party, right? She's liberal on social issues. She's been a staunch ally of the LGBT community. Her very first speech on the House floor, she gets to Congress after a special election. It's 1987, the height of the AIDS epidemic, and she's representing San Francisco, and she's just won this close election against a protege of Harvey Milk. And her very first speech on the House floor is, "I'm here to fight AIDS." And so she really took up that issue and drove it really aggressively, helped write the Ryan White Act and get it signed by a Republican president and get hundreds of millions of dollars now for healthcare for AIDS patients. So she was against not just the Iraq War, but the Gulf War. But on the Iraq War, she went up against a lot of top Democrats in opposing it. including the Democratic leadership in the House at the time. And she actually whipped her colleagues against the Democratic leadership, convincing them. She at the time was also the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. And she felt that, having seen a lot of the classified materials that the Bush administration was using to make its case, she didn't find it convincing, and she made that argument to her colleagues. And as a result, the majority of Senate Democrats voted in favor of authorizing the Iraq War, but the majority of House Democrats were against it, in large part because of her efforts. So there are a lot of, as you said, contradictions in her career. She is not a socialist, but she is a progressive. She is very wealthy and has constantly faced these accusations that because of that, she's out of touch. At the same time, the business community is certainly no fan of hers. She's probably public enemy number one for the Chamber of Commerce and the Koch brothers and so on. And so I think that places her sort of in the center of the left, right? Not on the center left. But then the other irony is that, we talk about her fight to become speaker again after the 2018 midterms, and the faction that mostly opposed her were the moderates and sort of moderate to conservative Democrats, including some of the freshmen who'd gotten elected in those tough districts by promising their constituents that they wouldn't support Nancy Pelosi when they got to Congress. It wasn't the so-called squad. It was not AOC and so on. They all supported her for speaker because they recognized that the alternative would be less progressive if there was one. Actually, nobody was running against her, but there was still this rebellion, right? But the irony is that today, those same moderates who gave her such a hard time to become speaker again, they are some of her biggest fans because of the way she's held the caucus together, because of the way she has kept the sort of aggressive, progressive voices from destabilizing and pulling apart the caucus. The line that any Democratic member of Congress has heard probably 1,000 times, she always says, our diversity is our strength, but our unity is our power. And she talks about, the leadership lessons that she learned from being a mother. She had 5 children in 6 years and didn't begin her political career in elected office until they were all pretty much grown and out of the house. But I think about that line whenever I'm trying to get my 3 kids to put their shoes on and leave the house and get in the van, because it's a similar thing, right? You've got all these competing interests, all these people who might have shared goals but can't necessarily see it because they're too busy arguing. And sometimes she'll grumble to her staff, well, I've got to be the mom here. Or do I have to use my mother of 5 voice? And I think it's a very similar dynamic, just with a lot more people and a lot bigger consequences in terms of keeping that caucus together and getting people to see that their interests do align, even if they don't like it.
Yeah, you have that line. Speaking of her kids, you have the line pretty early in the book, actually in the prologue, where you say, nothing teaches you to deal with unreasonable egomaniacs like having 5 young children in the house. And I just loved that.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So thank you for the insight on her politics. It's interesting that I feel like, yeah, she reins it in, and yet she also maybe does have a quality where she does make people feel heard. You talk about the long meetings that she'll have where she will stay, and, she's not a pushover. She's not even really like a bullshitter, but she'll stay and be there so that people feel heard, which seems to really, help and lend itself to the power that she does have.
Yeah, I mean, so much of effective leadership is just listening and making them feel heard, whether they are toddlers or politicians. And she really gets that, and she doesn't, and she, as you said, she doesn't bullshit people. She will not promise what she can't deliver. This is always the quality that President Obama most appreciated about her, was if she didn't think she could get the votes in the House, number one, you better believe it, because if anybody knows whether or not you can get the votes in the House, it's Nancy Pelosi. But number two, she's not going to promise you something that she can't deliver. She's not going to say, oh, she'll get that done, and then come back 2 weeks later and say, well, never mind. Or, if you're a incoming member in the caucus and you want to be on a certain committee, she's not going to pretend that she's going to give you it, and then you find out later that she gave it to someone else. She'll tell you up front, well, you're not going to get that. What else can I do for you? And so people really appreciate that, she'll tell you where she's coming from, and that she does listen to people, and that often that's all you have to do to bring people along, is just hear them out, and let them almost talk themselves into your position when they realize that they can talk until they're blue in the face, but they still don't have the votes for their position. And so if they want to get something done, they're going to have to follow the path that she's urging them to take. And a lot of times that works, just because people come to see that they've been heard, they've been listened to, their perspective is appreciated. But Nancy Pelosi is counting the votes, and she knows where the votes are, and you're going to have to do your part.
Yeah, like you say, she's very results oriented, and it's interesting. This wasn't on my list of questions, but it just occurred to me as you were talking, is that I wonder if there were moments when her counting the votes, because that's stressed over and over in the book, where it's like, it is very much about the numbers and knowing, she's practical. What is going to get done here? And so I'm just wondering if you think there have been times when she's had to, she's been so set on getting the result that she has intended that she kind of misses opportunities for maybe outside the box thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a lot of people would describe her as a visionary, right? Or a policy innovator. She is about getting stuff done, more than like having exotic ideas or new approaches to things. Not to say she isn't creative from a legislative standpoint, but I don't think most people would say that is her greatest strength. And she does perennially get accused of lacking imagination. For example, during impeachment, right? There were a lot of Democrats who thought that the impeachment drive should have begun much sooner based on the evidence in the Mueller report and other oversight that the Democrats were conducting. She had been sort of doubly scarred, first by going through the Clinton impeachment, which she believed was a joke. She told me that she thought that really Republicans never regarded Bill Clinton as a legitimate president because of class, because they didn't see him as high class enough to occupy that office. And then she lived through, being speaker for the first time when George W. Bush was president, and constantly, she had Code Pink protesters camped out in her front yard in San Francisco for weeks, demanding that she impeach President Bush. And, a lot of parallels to the situation today. She's speaker. There's an unpopular Republican president who is absolutely loathed by the left, and they believe that, is a moral imperative. And she is saying, well, what is that going to accomplish? What result is that going to achieve? It's going to be divisive. It's going to make people mad. It might be bad for us politically. And at the end of the day, he's still going to be president because there will not be the votes there to remove him. Right. But there's a line that she often quotes that I think gets misinterpreted. And you may recall this from the book. She loves this quotation from Abraham Lincoln where he says, public sentiment is everything. Without it, you can do nothing. With it, you can do anything. And people hear her say that, and I think justifiably think, well, what she's saying is you should only do things that are popular. You should stick your finger in the political wind, and then just sort of slavishly do what your voters want you to do. But that's actually not what she means by that. What she means is you have to educate the public before, you have to play the outside game before you can play the inside game. You have to go out there and organize. You have to go out there and make arguments. You have to go out there and educate your constituents. And then when you've built support among the public, then you can come into the House of Representatives and convince your colleagues to get behind something. So if you're AOC and you think we need to abolish immigration and customs, go out there and build support for that position. Go organize, go make the argument, go, convince the public. And then you can come to Congress and get people on board. But if all you're doing is sort of standing on principle and voting against something that everybody else in the caucus supports, that isn't doing anybody any good. So I think, to some people that is a narrow perspective. That does, and I do write in the book that I think her focus on hard power, while understandable, ignores some of the importance of soft power. But the reason it's understandable to me is, you mentioned her very first position on the San Francisco Library Commission in 1975. And that was when she really realized, if you're a woman and married to a wealthy man in 1975, nobody's necessarily going to listen to you when you open your mouth. Nobody's necessarily going to take you seriously just because you think you have something to say. But when you have a voice, when you have a vote, they have to listen. When you have a position, when you have authority, when you have hard power, that is the way people have to take you seriously. They have no choice. So I think you see that lesson carrying over to all of the phases of her career in party activism and elected office. That kind of hard power, that votes in Congress are what matters.
Yeah, that's That's so fascinating. You kind of also answered this question I had about like, there's such a weird like catch-22 with the legislators, where it's like if you risk, you know, having your approval rating go down if you take action and try to get things done. But if you don't, then you are just kind of sitting there and everyone also hates you for that, you know, like the voting public. So that was really insightful in terms of, oh yeah, you go out and gather that support from the outside because, you know, I mean, it's also, there's an example in the book, I can't remember exactly what the event was, what basically that kind of demonstrated the power of the people again, which I think was so relevant with the urgent, the calls right now for call your, you know, justice for, you know, well, that one hasn't really happened yet, justice for Breonna Taylor, but in terms of calling and demanding justice from our leaders, they kind of do have to kind of listen to us to some degree.
Yeah, and you know, she did a lot of behind the scenes organizing when it was time to preserve the Affordable Care Act, when Republicans had the majority in the House and Senate and Trump was president. And they did eventually manage to get to repeal the Affordable Care Act in the House, but did not get it through the Senate. And she was working with all of those outside groups and with, you know, Republican governors and other figures on the state and local level to create, you know, public opposition to repealing the Affordable Care Act. And she, you know, she was instrumental in getting the Affordable Care Act passed. And I write a lot about that in the book. And that was an instance where, you know, she told people at the time, you know, some form of universal access to healthcare, to health insurance, something Democratic presidents have been trying and failing to do for the better part of a century. She said, this is important enough to lose the majority over. No, who knows if she meant it, because she probably didn't think it was a possibility at the time, right? But she really did believe that, you know, you don't get power just to sit there. You get power to do something with it. And the was an example where, you know, after the Democrats lost their 60th vote in the Senate in January 2010, a lot of people, including people in the White House, wanted to give up. And she turned to President Obama directly and said, I know a lot of people around you want you to take, she has a funny vocabulary, she called it the namby-pamby approach. But I think we should press on. And part of her argument was, you know, we're already taking a beating for this. This is an unpopular proposal. People are mad at us for it. Republicans are going to use it against us in the election. So if we're going to suffer for it no matter what, why not at least have something to show for it, right? We can try and fail or we can try and succeed. Either way, we take a beating in November. So why not get it done? And she said to the president's chief of staff at one point, Rahm Emanuel, that, you know, the president wants to get things done and he wants to be beloved. Doesn't he know you can't have both? He has to choose. So that's very much her perspective, and it has a lot to do, I think, with the way her public image has been so demonized in so many ways, that she just sees that as the price she's willing to pay, because what's more important is achieving her legislative objectives.
Awesome. Yeah, I found the tone, the kind of critique that I picked up on the book towards the Obama administration, like actually really refreshing. And I was just wondering, I've heard you say in another interview that you were very clear that actually, no, they are on like really good terms and everything, like they are friends. But it was just definitely, you know, like critique of his negotiating skills and what he was willing to kind of leave on the table. And he would spend a lot of time kind of courting Senate Republicans without putting time into the, I mean, admittedly kind of annoying tasks of fluffing the, you know, the House Democrats, but there was definitely some bad vibes around that. But I was wondering if is she fairly public with her disillusionment about his lack of effectiveness as a negotiator, or is she kind of?
No, absolutely not. She would never say any of this in public. This is, you know, a lot of behind the scenes reporting on my part and a lot of others. And this was a persistent theme of sort of congressional coverage in the Obama era it's probably a perpetual dynamic, right? That congressional partisans feel like they don't get enough attention, enough care and feeding from the president of their party, and especially when the president is Barack Obama. Everyone in the Democratic caucus sort of idolized to have him not pay attention to them and invite all these Republicans over to the White House to watch the Super Bowl, I think is a little bit galling for, you know, unreasonable egomaniacs who want attention. But you know, Nancy Pelosi represented a lot of the things that Barack Obama ran against, right? The sort of dynastic establishment inside player, and he ran against all of Washington, not just the Republicans. And she is the consummate inside player, the consummate representative of the establishment, even on the sort of male-dominated Democratic establishment to get where she is. But so, you know, he came in with this perspective that, oh, you know, Washington's broken because these silly people just don't know how to get together and agree on things, and I'm going to teach them a thing or two. And she, frankly, I think, saw that as naive, and I think in a lot of ways was proven right, because over and over he did have this, you know, Lucy with the football dynamic with the Republicans in Congress, and she from the beginning was telling him, you know, they have no incentive to help you. You're better off just focusing on what you can get done and what I will tell you have the votes for and don't have the votes for, rather than this sort of doomed crusade to end partisanship in Washington.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, we really get a sense of Pelosi, and I loved the intimate. You just kind of get such a better feeling for who she is. I know for myself, I just had kind of the billboard image or whatever it was, the public perception, and now I just feel like I mean, there's still a distance there. You know, like you say, she's a private person. There's definitely still an arm's length. But on the other hand, you just getting to know about her life and her effectiveness and her approach to things, I think was just so fascinating. So she's very much characterized as operational. She's a strategist, and her staff describes her as like an Energizer bunny. And you pointed it out, you know, they talk about how they can't, you know, they can't plan any kind of sightseeing if they go traveling with her. Like, you're not going to go to the Berlin Wall, so you can just like forget about that. So anyway, I was interested in that vibe of her. Like, do you think some people are just built that way, like hyper productive and tireless? You know, what keeps you going?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is innate. Certainly, I mean, she doesn't get a lot of sleep. She never seems to eat. She does not drink alcohol or caffeine. She's on her feet all the time. She's 80 years old and has the energy of you know, 3 young people. She talks a lot actually about how motherhood, you know, I think a lot of parents can relate to this, the way that becoming a parent for the first time sort of expands your sense of your own capacities. You suddenly realize you have these like reserves of energy that you didn't previously know about. And she talks about it in that way, that just she sort of discovered what she was capable of when she became a mother for the first time. And I look at that and I think, you know, for centuries of human history, women have had this like amazing training in leadership and coalition building and in summoning the energy to deal with all kinds of different tasks at once. And until now, it's never been tapped in the political arena. And it's interesting to think about, you know, all of that talent sort of getting left on the table. But, you know, I'm not the first person to ask her this question, but if you ask her like, oh my gosh, how do you do it? You keep this punishing schedule and you seem to be in 10 places at once and showing up to things and having meetings with people. And she will just give you a completely blank look, straight face. Well, I'm Italian. We have great stamina. And that's her answer to the question. She just believes that because she's Italian, she was born with it.
There you go. I mean, it's like both a boast and modest. The Italian pride with like absolute modesty. Wow. So yeah, I have more questions about Republicans and things like that, but we are running at a little bit into like audience question time. So I guess I should share you with the people here tonight. So let me just take a little scan here of our questions. Okay, so actually good. So some of these we did get to. Oh yeah, this is an interesting question that you spent some time in the book talking about. So here's the question. Molly provided a detailed and fascinating account about Pelosi's role in securing the Presidio land. And we're on the Bay Area here. So I was wondering, yeah, how was that research for you?
Yeah, that was a really formative experience in her early career. And I actually spend the better part of a chapter on it in the book because it's such an interesting sort of lesson in congressional mechanics. And it taught her a lot about how to get things done in Congress. So, you know, she gets to Congress and there's a proposal on the table the Presidio was still a military base at that time, the longest continually active military installation in the United States, going back to like the 1700s. And so she and some of her California colleagues, including Barbara Boxer, wanted to turn it into a national park. So they're all excited about this effort, and they go to one of the more senior members, a sort of crusty, chauvinistic, old conservative Democrat named Jack Murtha, who was one of her great mentors, and sort of unlikely allies, right, in the Congress. And they were like, well, let's do this. Let's turn it into a national park. And he immediately tells them that they are being naive. There's a much more strategic way to do this than just trying to national park. In fact, you can prolong this battle to get the Army to pay for a lot of the site remediation and cleanup, so that, because if the Park Service has to pay for all of that, Republicans will never agree to it. So they do this sort of series of clever maneuvers to offload a lot of the cost. But, you know, she angered a lot of progressives in that fight as well, because there was a very vocal constituency for turning the site into public housing. And to this day, the Alt Weekly in San Francisco does not endorse her in any election, in part because they believe that she was responsible for privatizing Presidio. And, you know, she came up with this idea of a public-private partnership that would make the site self-sufficient, because she knew that successive administrations, particularly Republican administrations, were not going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, more than the combined cost of Yellowstone and Yosemite, to keep up this little patch of land in San Francisco, as beautiful as it is. But that was really one of the early episodes in her career in terms of learning how to find allies, learning how to make your case on the outside and the inside, right? Finding pressure points for finding, California Republicans who will support you and vouch for you to other Republicans, finding, donors who know someone who can lean on a senator up in Alaska or something like that. And then negotiating tactics like pretending that you're conceding something really painful when actually you're giving away something you didn't even want. And that was something that she did over the course of those negotiations and has done in various negotiations since then. And it's sort of a standard tool of good negotiators, but that was one of her formative experiences in that regard.
Yeah, it was cool to hear how she kind of played the different sides. Like she kind of made everyone who had an interest in it she kind of kept them separate and kind of worked them a little bit in a way that I found kind of masterful, to be like an early learning experience. So yeah, that was.
A lot of people have described these sort of old school vote wrangling skills as like anachronistic in some way, which kind of makes me sad, right? The idea that the very concept of just basic effective congressional blocking and tackling is seen as old fashioned because so few people do it anymore.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that is owing to the kind of, the more recent influx, 2018 and 2016 too, of just kind of these inexperienced, people coming in. Like I own a restaurant and, I'm running now. And in a way, like that's kind of awesome, right? Because we get a sense of, I feel like there can be such a kind of a disconnect in any situation where there's decisions being made that affect lots of people, even as a bookstore, and things like that. So I think it's kind of cool for the public to get involved, but then you do wonder what's the price of that, I guess, in terms of not really maybe having the training on how to make this government work, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think she would probably argue, and I don't speak for her to be clear, but I think she would probably argue that experience has gotten a bad name in politics, and that there has to be a place for diverse perspectives and citizen legislators. The idea that this country was founded on people from all walks of life getting elected and representing their local communities, but that doesn't mean that experience is worthless or inherently corrupting. And in fact, knowing the process, knowing the intricacies, knowing the sort of all of the ugly ways in which the sausage gets made, that has sort of sadly been discredited when that also is very valuable and plays a role if what you want is competent, experienced leadership. We have seen, particularly in the last decade, although it's probably a perennial strand of our politics, but particularly in the last decade, right, we've seen experience sort of weaponized and turned into a negative. But you saw, for example, when she became speaker for the second time in January 2019, this sort of triumphant comeback where she retakes the gavel after those 8 years in the wilderness, I'm sorry, where was I going?
Oh, no,
experience. So so it's in the middle of the government shutdown, right? She and Donald Trump are at odds. That's what that whole encounter in the Oval Office was about. And she eventually she sends him this letter saying, well, I'm canceling your State of the Union. You're no longer invited to give this speech in the House chamber. And I think that's an example of, you know, a less experienced speaker would not have known that that lever of power existed, would not have realized, oh, here's a point of leverage that I have. And because the procedure is such, because I know that the State of the Union happens when the House invites the president to come to the chamber and give a speech, if I can give that, I can take it away. And so that was a maneuver that was a product of her experience and her knowledge of procedure, and being around for a long time, knowing the procedure in that way gives you leverage.
Cool. In terms of the other women in Congress and in leadership roles, not just Congress, excuse me, is there like a club for these kind of ambitious, very scrutinized women? Like I'm thinking of, you know, you mentioned Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein, and Hillary Clinton comes up a little bit. But like, is she hanging out with, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Madeleine Albright, or like Elizabeth Warren, who's my personal hero?
No, there's not a club. But you know, they're not hostile to each other either. There's sometimes you get these sort of sexist catfight narratives projected onto these women's relationships when they're politicians, they're individual political actors. They have their own careers and priorities to consider. And she's so much a creature of the House too, that you know, she certainly, you know, she knows Joe Biden, but he's always been a Senate whisperer. He went straight to the Senate when he was elected in 1972, and when he was in the Obama White House, that was much more his role, was dealing with the Senate. So, you know, she's so focused on the House that they just didn't spend as much time together. But and her relationship with Hillary is kind of fraught. There's a lot about that about her relationship with both Clintons that has sometimes been chilly. They sort of are in different orbits. And she clashed with President Clinton repeatedly over human rights and trade in China. In fact, she came out and called him a liar, the president of her own party, and was very cutting toward him for going back on his promises to her in that regard. And this is one of her great passions that not a lot of people know about. But she actually, you know, went to Tiananmen Square in 1991 and caused an international incident by protesting in favor of Chinese human rights. So she and Hillary, I've heard, have actually gotten a little bit closer in recent years, in part because they've bonded over their shared distress over Trump and their concern, particularly over Russia. They're both very concerned about the Russian influence on the administration and the different complications of that. So they have, I've been told, had some conversations where they've sort of bonded. But they have really been in different orbits their whole career. And then, you know, you mentioned, you know, other women leaders. One of the interesting things I find about Nancy Pelosi is she was the first woman to lead a party in Congress when she became minority leader in 2002. She's still the only woman to lead a party in Congress. And she's the most, depending on how you measure it, but I would argue the most powerful woman in American political history as speaker. And so she's forging her own path. She calls it shattering the marble ceiling. There isn't a role model. There isn't an archetype. There isn't a stereotype people have in their heads about what a woman speaker should be, should look like, should act like. And I think she has forged a different type of image than a lot of powerful women. A lot of women seeking political power almost try to impersonate men in order to seem serious, right? They're tough on national security, or they wear these sort of like masculine outfits, and they never talk about their families because that would make them seem soft in the eyes of voters. And that has never been her sensibility. She's always sort of foregrounded her femininity. She's always talked about her family as being her reason for being in politics, talked about how much she cares about the children, brought all of her grandchildren up on the dais with her both times that she became speaker. And you know, everything, the way she dresses and presents herself and everything else. And so I think she's really created a different model of powerful womanhood than a lot of other women who have tried to forge that path.
Yeah, and the way she really does. She, like, when there's a tour of some kind, and she like, I'll be there, except like they'll go to places where fundraisers where her daughter is, or like when one of her daughters was going to give birth, it's like, okay, well, I'll be there in the morning unless there's a baby, and then I'm not going to be there. You know, she's able to kind of make that a part of her of her life, even in a public way, which was inspiring to me to kind of see that. Let's see, I think we've got one more question here. Oh, this is interesting. Is Nancy Pelosi bringing along or mentoring younger women that you know of? Does she kind of, what's her relationship with kind of the up and coming women in the government?
So yes and no. She has, one of the big critiques of her, particularly from other Democrats, is that she hasn't groomed a successor. She hasn't brought anyone up to succeed her. There will be a huge void when she leaves, in part because the two other leaders of the Democratic caucus have also been there for 17 years, which has created this stalemate in the Democratic caucus. But she's spent a long time encouraging women to run for office, and it's been an uphill battle. A lot of women, particularly, they see the attacks that she's subjected to, and they don't want to go through that. They don't want to, and so I think until 2016, she would talk to a lot of women who country in some other way by being a prosecutor or being a social worker or being an academic or being a leader in the military. Only after Trump was elected that's it. I can't take this. I've got to enter this arena, no matter how big it is. And so she found that very, very gratifying. And she does try to, and she fact that there are now, for the first time in history, 100 women in the 435 member House of Representatives. About 90 of them Democrats, in large part because of that recruiting that she's helped with. And also that happens to coincide with the centennial of women's right to vote. So I think she finds that symbolism very powerful. But part of why she hasn't groomed a successor is she's someone who really believes that power is not something that is handed to you. It's something you take. It is something you fight for. It is something you have to take away from someone in many cases. And when she first decided to seek a position in leadership in 1998, she'd been in the House for a decade. She'd been doing the work. She hadn't been climbing the leadership ladder, but she'd been serving on committees and working on legislation and focused on policy as well as, fundraising and political activities. And then when she did decide she wanted to seek a slot in the top leadership, the word got back to her that the sort of men in charge of the Democratic establishment were grumbling to each other, well, who said she could run? And this just infuriated her. Hated the idea that she had to ask anybody's permission. She'd been there for a decade. She'd seen what the men were capable of. She'd realized they, in her words, had no special sauce. She knew she was capable of everything that they were. And so she found that so infuriating, and she just used it for motivation. There's another, I don't think this detail made it into the book, but another thing that word got back to her that the men in charge were saying was, well, if the women want things, why don't they just give us a list and we'll done? Why did they have to be the ones to positions? And so again, she said, well, that just lights my fire. And so she used that for motivation. So when someone at one point said, well, when are you going to pass the baton? And she said, well, everybody's got a baton in their purse and they can take it out when they want to.
Nice. Yeah, she's tough. She doesn't, I like that about her. It's kind of, there's such pressure to be likable and all of this, all these things that, women deal with. And I think I really appreciated really spending some time with such a strong figure, like someone who doesn't apologize for who she is or what she does. She's there to get things done. She's really effective. It was really just really inspiring. I was like chattering to people in my life about it. Did you know Nancy Pelosi? So yeah,
they all about the book. But yeah, I mean, so much. That is one of the big themes of the book is, and we've heard some about this in the presidential race, particularly with regard to Elizabeth Warren, unpacking these ideas of likability and how women are perceived and how women seem always to be sort of held accountable for people's opinions of them. That, Donald Trump is by many measures the most unpopular president in modern history, but no one ever seems to ask him, like, why do you think you have such a likability problem? What can you do to get people to feel more warm and fuzzy about you? Isn't this your fault that people don't like you? And yet it's always the first question for Nancy Pelosi or for Hillary Clinton. And I wanted to take a step back and question, well, why is it that they are such quote unquote polarizing figures?
Awesome. Just one last question, and then we will release for the evening. But you do spend a bit of time on Newt Gingrich in the book, which I found really interesting. I recognize him from the current events as obviously a pretty odious character, and he's popped up, you know, in the more recent times. But, you know, in the 80s and 90s, he really, you know, put into play a lot of the stuff that is now working to really create this gridlock and this partisanship and everything. And I was kind of just wondering your thoughts on how functional our government is right now. And I don't know, why are Republicans the way they are? Like, why don't they want to help people? You know, I don't know if that's too big of a, I don't know if you have just a couple thoughts on that, on the functionality
it's
of our
not
government.
something I can cover in, you know, the
You've got 1 minute.
But I will say, look, a lot of this book is a sort of capsule history of modern American congressional politics and the way that it has changed and become so toxic in the modern era. And one of the things that I think Nancy Pelosi doesn't get enough credit for is the way that she has managed to be effective, not just on a historical scale, right? I'm not a historian or a political scientist, but the historians and political scientists will tell you that they do consider her one of the most effective speakers in modern history. They do put her up there with LBJ and Sam Rayburn in terms of the great congressional leaders, when you can measure it in various empirical ways. And I think it's all the more remarkable that she's been able to forge that kind of effectiveness in a Congress that most people do think is hopelessly broken and gridlocked and impossible to get things done in. She's someone who very much sees politics as the art of the possible. And I think it's fair to say that, love her or hate her, it is an art that she has mastered.
Wow. Well, this has been just absolutely I can't think of a better way to spend my evening. So I just really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate your wonderful book. I don't know after this experience if you will write another one, but we hope so, because this one was fantastic. So just a reminder, everyone, you can purchase your copy by clicking on buy the book below. And yeah, you definitely don't want to miss out on Pelosi. It is fantastic. And it's beautiful. I mean, this is like, you want it on your bookshelf, you know?
That's right. I didn't design it, so I can say that, but yes.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for supporting your local independent bookstore. It's so important, especially right now.
Thanks, Molly. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you. You too.